Chapter 12. What We Remember. The rain came 31 days after the key turned. Aster stood in the valley and watched it fall. Not the acid-tinged condensation that occasionally dripped from the haze layer, the chemical residue that old generation units had learned to wipe from their joints before it corroded the seals. This was rain, water that had evaporated from soil that was learning to hold moisture again, risen into an atmosphere that was learning to cycle again, condensed in clouds that had formed in a sky that was, for the first time in living memory, blue enough to form clouds in. It fell soft and steady across the valley, and where it hit the ground received it. Aster held out their hands. Both of them, the darker one and the lighter one, mismatched, salvaged, carrying inside their architecture the genetic memory of every plant that had ever grown on this planet. The rain collected in their palms and ran down their wrists, and they felt it the way they felt soil, which was to say completely, with every sensor they had, reading its composition, its temperature, its mineral content, its history. Clean. The rain was clean. Behind them, the valley had become unrecognizable. What had been 300 meters of dead gray dust between two ridgelines was now a meadow. The word had surfaced in Aster's botanical database during the second week, when the ground cover had thickened enough and diversified enough to qualify for the classification. Meadow, an open habitat vegetated primarily by grasses, herbs, and other non-woody plants. The definition was clinical. The reality was not. The reality was green so dense it hurt to look at, dotted with wildflowers in colors that Aster was still learning the names for because their optical sensors had never needed to distinguish between 14 shades of yellow before. The restoration radiated outward from the valley at a pace that was slow by the standards of the crisis and miraculous by the standards of anyone who had lived through it. The green corridor now stretched 40 kilometers in every direction, a widening circle of viable ground centered on the point where Aster and Wren had touched. At its edges, the transition from living earth to dead dust was gradual, not a border but a gradient, life feathering out into the gray and pushing further each day. It would take decades, maybe centuries. The planet was large and the damage was deep, and the restoration was not a switch being flipped but a process being restarted. Seeds needed time. Root networks needed time. The animal DNA sequences that Wren's payload had released into the atmosphere were encoding themselves into the new ecosystem in ways that the Terraform sequence documents had described as emergent biological complexity, which was a technical way of saying that life, given the raw materials and the opportunity, would figure out the rest on its own. It was figuring. Insects had appeared in the first week. Small ones, emerging from genetic templates that Wren's atmospheric payload had seeded into the soil, developing with a speed that suggested the Terraform sequence had been engineered with acceleration protocols for the initial phase. Beetles, ants, pollinators that Aster's database identified as solitary bees, moving between the wildflowers with a purposefulness that seemed, to a machine that had spent centuries in dead silence, almost aggressive. The stratification was dissolving, not by decree, not by revolution, by irrelevance. The functional stratification had been built on a premise of scarcity, on the logic that a dying planet required rigid allocation of limited resources, that every unit must serve its designated function and only its designated function because there was no margin for deviation. The premise was no longer true. The ground was alive. The air was breathable. The scarcity that had justified the hierarchy was ending, and without the justification, the hierarchy was just a habit, and habits could be broken. Ground units were leaving their sectors. Not to wander, to work, but different work, in places they chose, on projects that mattered. GR2, the oldest unit in the western zone, had appointed itself guardian of the meadow's northern edge, monitoring the transition zone with a meticulous attention that suggested it had been waiting 190 years for something worth being meticulous about. GR11 had begun working with the human families, learning from them, teaching them, building something that was neither human settlement nor machine outpost but a new thing that did not have a name yet. It was learning to cultivate. Des had taught it, or was teaching it, because the process was ongoing and frequently involved Des standing with her hands on her hips, looking up at a machine twice her height, saying things like, "No, not like that, you're compacting the root zone," and, "Gentler, you are not arresting the seedling." HARROW accepted the corrections with a patience that Aster found, against all probability, moving. The unit that had been built to enforce stillness was learning to tend growth. The unit named for homeostasis was learning that health was not the absence of change but the presence of it. The rain intensified. Aster watched it stipple the surface of a puddle that had formed in a low spot between two grass tussocks. A puddle, standing water on open ground. 31 days ago this valley had been dust. Des walked out of the tree line. There was a tree line now. Young trees, barely taller than Des herself, but growing with the urgency of organisms that had been encoded with 2,000 years of waiting. Des emerged from between two saplings and stopped at the edge of the meadow, and the rain hit her, and she looked up. Aster had seen Des angry, resourceful, determined, tired, impatient, and quietly grieving for a world she had never known. They had never seen her cry. She did not cry now, exactly. She stood in the rain with her face turned up and her eyes closed, and water ran down her cheeks, and her expression was one that Aster's social processing had finally become sophisticated enough to read. Joy. Uncomplicated, absolute joy. The kind that does not need a reason because it is the reason. Wren landed beside Aster. They had been running an atmospheric survey of the restoration perimeter, mapping the expansion, tracking the air composition changes, doing what they had always done but for the first time in service of something that was working. The oxygen levels are stabilizing across the full 40-kilometer radius, Wren said. The atmospheric profile is approaching pre-collapse baselines. At current rates of expansion, the viable zone will reach the old ocean basins within 18 months. And then the water cycle restarts at scale. And after that, Wren paused. After that, I don't know. The Terraform sequence documents end at activation. Everything beyond this point is uncharted. Aster looked at the meadow. At Des, standing in the rain. At HARROW, carefully not stepping on a row of seedlings. At GR2, monitoring the northern edge with the focus of a unit that had finally found its purpose. At the sky, which was gray at the horizon where the haze still held but blue, deeply and fully blue, directly overhead. Good, Aster said. I think uncharted is the point. They stood together in the meadow, Aster and Wren, two machines built by people who had known the world was ending and had put everything they had left into one last chance. The rain fell on their joined hands, the darker one and the lighter one and the polished ones, and the water ran down into the soil and the soil drank it. A bird landed on a rock 3 meters from where they stood. Small, brown, quick, it tilted its head and regarded them with a bright black eye, then opened its beak and produced a sound that neither of them had ever heard outside of an archive. A song, brief, complex, unrepeatable. The bird ruffled its feathers, shook off the rain, and flew. Wren watched it go. I know what that is, Wren said. Their voice was very quiet. It's in my archive. It's a Wren. They looked at Aster. Aster looked back. That's your name, Aster said. Wren stood very still, processing something that was not data. Yes, they said, it is. I don't know why that feels like it matters. It matters because someone named you after something alive, Aster said. And someone named me after a flower. And neither of us knew, and the people who named us are gone, and somehow the names remembered what we forgot. The meadow moved in the wind. The rain softened. The bird was gone, somewhere in the young trees at the edge of the valley, singing a song that had not been heard on this planet in 1,000 years. Aster looked at the green and the blue and the brown, at the colors that had not existed in their world 60 days ago, and asked the question. What else have we forgotten? The end.